Hey, my name's Bruce Snell. I'm with BSG, and what we're doing today is that we're working on Class 6, and we're going to be focusing on defining the organizational team structure. So if everyone will open up their book and turn to the executive summary, which is on page 1. Now, the reason our last class that we went over was trying to set up the organizational structure. And remember, everything that we're talking about, we can't forget about the 4 barriers to quality. Okay, as we developed this Base Work Systems 2000 over these last 11 years, we realized that in order to implement these changes in the organization, we had to develop the team and the team structure. So the first of all, one of the things coming out of the box is that we start laying out the organizational structure. And if you guys are doing that, you're already going to see that we're already some problems and some issues that started cropping up. So now that we've defined the organizational structure, what in effect it does is that it almost starts laying out the base work centers and the departments for the team structure. That's why we have to do the organizational structure first. So in effect, that's what we're saying. One thing kind of complements the other throughout the entire series here. So if you look at developing the team structure, this is how we're going to impact the organization, and this is how we're going to implement this change in this quality, this 4 barriers to quality. So let's look at the product of lack of training, the team structure. A usual scenario finds no budget for training. Some organizations take a hit and a miss approach to training. Many organizations never really get started with a training program. If you're looking at what the lack of training looks like, even though we covered this in workshop 4 or in class 4, we want to look at what is happening. Remember, most of the time in these organizations we have absolutely no budget for training. So remember, we talked about when do we usually train? After we got a problem. So we train after a tragedy, and we know how expensive that thing is. So we're saying hit and a miss approach to training. What we're talking about there is that we're kind of going about it depending on whatever happens to be on the table at the time is what we're training. Or the training goes off in this direction. Let's start looking at strategic planning, personal skill training, computer training. Well, what you see is one part of the organization is going over here and receiving training. Another part of the organization is not. And if you look at all these different training pieces we do, they're not really going in any one particular direction. And in fact, they're really going in their own direction. We talked earlier about many organizations never really get started with their training program. I want to emphasize this, is that a lot of companies and a lot of organizations, a lot of employees that leave one company to the other, they always say, when I get either to the next company or I start my own organization, I am going to do training. But trying to get the cash flow up, trying to get the organization up and running becomes priority. And then when we start getting the animal up and running, then the business starts taking over, and we're too busy to step back and do the training and define the organizational structure. So this is how we get into that loop. And what we're saying is that it's really tough starting. That's why we have to have the discipline. The product of lack of training, they all say in the beginning they're going to have a training program because the other organizations they were with didn't have one. Training is viewed as an expense and not as an asset. Now, what we're looking at there is that we're saying that, again, we intend to start training, but we never do. And then it says most training products go in their own direction and are not necessarily job specific. So you got a couple of things that we're talking about right here. Training is viewed as an expense and not as an asset, meaning that you got people there, believe me, at these budget meetings and the whole bit, or in the organization, throwing their stuff down because now we're having to budget out, because I'm also sometimes getting an incentive or a bonus on the numbers, and that money, that 2 to 6%, is just coming out of my bonus pay. That's the problems with all these incentives and bonuses, and we'll talk about all that stuff later. So if you look at it, we view the training as an expense and not as an asset. And when we're talking about job specific, most of the training program is not job specific, meaning that really I've had so many people after we've gone through the training or just the introductory to the seminars that we have, is that they're going, you know, Bruce, the company sent us the training, they meant well, they're doing everything they can to help training, but when I go back, it doesn't really apply to my job, or I don't know how to apply it. And when we're in school, most of us, we learn all this stuff, and usually in school they give us one extreme to the next. And they're saying, hey, it's somewhere here in the middle, and when you get out there in the workplace, you figure it out. So again, we're saying most of the products kind of going in their own direction and really are not job specific. And it says here, how do we address the lack of training? You have to budget at least 2 to 6% of payroll for training. That's a good number in which to begin. My research over the last 10 or 11 years, we looked at as I went into these organizations, not only did we not know where to start, but we didn't know how much to budget. And what I saw is that companies on an average, depending on the size, budgeted 2 to 6% of payroll is a good number. And there are companies out there that budget 10 to 20, 12% or whatever. There's a lot of companies that are doing that, and they treat that training as an asset. So where do you begin? Look at beginning to budget 2 to 6% of payroll. Set the schedule for training a year in advance. This is an interesting thing here. Everybody starts squealing when you start talking about doing that because we can't even hold one meeting to the next. How many of you started a production meeting, a office meeting, and we carry it out for almost 1 week in a row, and then we never do it again? Or if we start, we're an hour late, 2 hours late, we're going to do it Tuesday, don't get back till it Wednesday, then all of a sudden it's forgotten. So the reason we train and start setting that training schedule a year in advance, it starts setting some disciplines internally within the organization, because most of us have never really planned any more than a day or a fire ahead. So the training has to be done a year in advance, and then we're starting to kind of eliminate some excuses of why I didn't do training. And we try to pick that training date the same day of each month, usually in the first week, second week, or something like that. This is one of the first formal things with which your organization will struggle, because you'll hear the what ifs, you'll hear every reason in the world why we can't do it, and what you're going to hear is that your organization is really going to struggle with trying to set a year in advance training. And usually one of the most frustrating folks in a company is the human resource or the training department, because they're getting no cooperation usually with anyone else in the organization. And so what happens, it becomes very frustrating. They're spending their time going to try and drag people into training, and then the guy's sitting there, well, what do you want me to do, get the product out? We got to do both, but that's a part of the discipline. That's where we're also talking about have to have the commitment at the top. It's unrealistic because your employees are sitting there looking at you for direction and leadership. And if my boss didn't do it, believe me, I'm not going to do it. If my boss complains about it, believe me, we're all going to complain about it. And I'm also wondering, is my boss looking at me and does he support it? Because whether the guy at the top wants it or not, my immediate world is who I'm reporting to and working around. And that person at the top, I guarantee you 99% of the time does want it. That's why we have to reinforce it down through the organization and not come to a meeting and going, hey, where were you at? Oh, I was at a training, and then throw the papers down and go, God, that training, I don't even know why we ever. What kind of message is that sending to your people? Remember, the 4 barriers are also there. Remember the fear. So every time you do something like that, we start questioning whether we should contribute or not. So we're going to take the tone of the organization is going to take it from each of our bosses and co-workers, but the co-workers are going to get it from the managers. So we really need to be conscious of what in the world that we're doing. And it says, how do we address the lack of training? The next one is you have to train the personnel in regards to interpersonal skills and communication. It was really interesting early on as we got out there, we realized a lot of our people didn't have base skills. So we really had to look at it and talk about how in the world we communicate both verbally and physically, and how we respond to things with our body language really start setting the tone of perception and how we're taken, either by our family members, our co-workers, or our customers. So we realized very early into the game that we had employees that just didn't have interpersonal skills. And if you look at it, those skills have to, the base skills have to include people and process skills. Next, let's look at manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. Self-help as well as process, steps, procedures, and systems training. We're looking at here, we have to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. And we have to have self-help skills in order to help ourselves, not only in the organization, but also personally, because you can't help one without the other, and each one benefits the other. So we have to focus on both the skills. The base skills include people and process skills. And it looks at, as well as the process steps and procedures and the systems. Remember, by developing those base work centers, those process steps and procedures, start creating the systems. Really, here's a system here. We're yanking out a process, and that could be my base work center. By defining all those processes, create the system. So it looks at once training is in process, you begin to have employees cross-training one another. All right, as we start defining our base work center process and steps and our procedures, not only are we training and defining and coming to an agreement on how to do it, which in effect is improving it, but now we're building the tool not only to train new employees, but we're also building the tool to train and cross-train other employees. So that's what we're talking about internally. You start having internal trainers. Okay, let's look down a little further. You have proactive training. What are the results of all this? The results is that you have proactive training. Proactive training means when you get this thing in motion, you're training the employees, we're defining those base work centers, we're defining the interpersonal skills, we're looking at process, step, procedure skills. The training then becomes very proactive because all these issues that we'll be addressing and bringing up will take the training program into a particular direction, and it will be specific toward each individual's job or each base work center. So in effect, you will have proactive training. We're not going to wait for a tragedy before we start training because we got so much stuff to work on and define and training. That's why it's continuous, because your organization is continuously training. So this is the reason that we need to look at breaking up the organization by teams. You formalize the employee training through written procedure. You have new leadership appear as the results of training from within. Interesting, what we're saying here is that as we're formalizing the training with written procedure. Remember, who is the best guy to tell us how to do the job? The best guy to do that is the person doing the job. And who's the best person to define it? We have to give them the skills, the skills training, the process, the support, the responsibility to do that. Because remember, they're powerless. So as we start developing our base work centers, developing our people, new leaders start appearing. And the new leaders start appearing, in fact, they start getting involved in defining their jobs, coming to an agreement on processes, and you'll see that some of these employees, and I'm not saying that it doesn't happen now, a majority of our employees already taking work home. They will take this stuff home and work on it because they can see the value in it. And this is another good way to make us all kind of feel like we belong. Training can be continuously improved, delegated, and monitored because now you have systems, process, and scheduling throughout the organization. This is one of the interesting things that we talked about in developing this team structure, is that most of the training is not going in any particular direction. We usually schedule it whenever we feel like we got something to train on, or after a tragedy, which everything kind of hurries up. So if we have a formal training program, then we can continuously improve it and delegate it and monitor it. We can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the thing because we put the teams together, which is what we're going to be working on today, and we're going to be able to define this thing throughout the organization. So we'll be able to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor it. Another reason for that schedule. So let's look at your entire organization can go from one training class to another because the terminology and direction is the same. What we're saying here, by developing your base work center process and steps, your team training and the organizational, defining those systems and all these other things in this ABS program, is that all the employees internally receive the same training. Because what will happen is we are taking these base skills that we're learning, we're taking them back and we're applying them specific to our job. So what happens is if I miss a meeting, I can go to another meeting because we're receiving the same training. We're just taking it and applying it to our job. So it says you can't shut down processing of our order request in order to do training. That's another interesting thing. When we first started, it says we got to have everybody that's doing the same job and the same stuff have to be in the same meeting. In theory, that sounds awesome, but in fact is we realized we were shutting the place down. So what we're saying here is look at those teams by internal, customer, and supplier, trying to get everybody together we can. But by working in this base work systems, we discover that working on these base skills, that no matter who you are in the organization, you could sit in somebody else's training class. And by mixing the base work centers, this was how we were able to keep the business up and running, because we didn't have to pull everybody out of the working on the phones. We didn't have to pull out the receptionists. We didn't have to shut down the production plant. We were able to commingle those base work centers that always left somebody there that was working that particular job. Okay, let's look at the training focus. Let's look now on page 3. Page 3, the training focus, the understanding of order request. And what we're talking about there is that we have to understand that everything that we're doing and building is to support our order request. Remember, order is external, request is internal. So by focusing in is that everything there is to support our product and service. How will we provide a product and or service? We want to make sure that whatever we're selling that we can support. So that's the focus of our training, the data entry, collection, and reporting. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on those systems of entry, collection, and reporting, because that's how we manage and monitor the organization. And for some of you high-tech companies out there, you can either plan and schedule with this, but most of my companies we have is that we don't have that. We have to manually plan and schedule. So if you look at this, the 4 M's, managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring, the 4 M's, manpower, machine, material, and methods. So again, we're looking at focusing in and doing and planning and scheduling, everybody going in the same direction. The goal, all employees self-manage, knowing their responsibilities and responding with accuracy. Again, what we're talking about there is that if we're all focusing in, we're all working on our base work center, we become a very focused organization at all levels. And not only that, but then we know our responsibilities and we become self-managed. We have talked about this before. If we define our processes and come to an agreement with everyone that's involved in them, then we can become self-managed. That's why we're saying the base skills are so important. We have to be able to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor internally within the organization. And when we got the base skills, we can respond with whatever, a change of a work order, change of an order, change of a customer's order, a change of a computer system, a change of a machine, a change of software, it doesn't matter. And we can respond with accuracy because of the base skills that we're leading. Okay, next, let's look at on page 4. I'd like for you to look at page 4. We've been talking now about, but basically we talked last time about the organizational systems. Now we're going to look at breaking the company up. That's why we had to have the systems, which before that we had to define the structure. Is that the training leadership selection process? Who are the ones that are going to help orchestrate this training, and what do they do? On page 4 here, we look at the training leadership selection process. If you look at that steering committee and representatives, what we're saying there, and that steering committee and stuff's been around quite a while. If you look at the steering committee, are the ones that are laying down what we're going to do, and responsible for the leadership of the program, which usually has to do with upper management. And what we're saying here is that we have also a steering committee representative. And that is, if the steering committee member can't be there, let them have a representative. Now, the steering committee usually up front have a tendency to all be upper management. Now, example, one of our organizations now, they're now going through and bringing people through all levels now. Actually, it was kind of the board and department heads that made up the steering committee. Now what they're doing is bringing up everyone else in the organization now. And so they're kind of mixing it out. So that should be our goal, is that steering committee represent across the organization. But up front, you're not going to get the volunteers. It's amazing. And that's mainly to do with the 4 barriers, because we tried it before and we all know what happened. Okay, so next is a coordinator. The coordinator is the person that's coordinating the entire training program. Now, if you have a training director, they might be the coordinator, but I'd also look for somebody internally that, I don't care, with whatever knowledge a person might have, if they have the enthusiasm and a good attitude, that's our best coordinator. If they want to get in there and shake it up and make things happen, and this is of an interest to them, that's the person you want. We have a tendency to try to push in there upper management or a boss. Well, we're saying here that doesn't necessarily have to come from management. We'd rather have it come throughout the organization. But what you'll see up front, it won't, because of the fear mainly is that they're not going to trust, and so I'm not going to get involved. This is another thing they're throwing at us. So the coordinator is literally the one that's reporting to the steering committee, and then they're collecting all the data and really kind of managing the program along with the steering committee. Next are facilitators. All right, up front, the steering committee selects the facilitators. Again, because trying to get folks to volunteer up front, they're already overworked, already overstressed. They won't do that, so that's where we usually have to get the management to work as a facilitator. And basically, the facilitator takes care of what we call our monthly overviews of, basically, it's a collection of the data of what's happening internally within the organization, and quarterly audits. And then they report that to the coordinator. Also to the facilitator, if the team leader is not there to give the team meeting, the facilitator gives the meeting. Make sure the agendas are done and the whole bit. Number 4 is what we call Facilitator Manager. And what we're saying here is that all managers in the organization are Facilitator Managers, which in turn they all belong to the training leadership. Because all management internally within the organization has to participate. I've already stubbed my toe on that 100 years ago. And that is that we kind of did like everybody else was telling us, kind of asked for volunteers. And what happened, we had some managers that were dug in, and now I know what they were doing. They were holding us hostage. And so what happened was they didn't participate. So what happened, the more we did internally with the teams, the more knowledge the team members got, the further detached the management got, or their boss. For the fact is, the employees started using the terminology and started going around fixing things. And so that, in effect, got the management and the ones that weren't participating to dig in. And so they almost refused to participate by then. And by that time, they just started shutting down everything around it and became very frustrated. So we're saying all management has to participate, because we're all looking for management for the leadership. It's not going to happen without leadership. Okay, management. Now, what we're saying here is, well, I kind of talked about Facilitator Manager, because all management that have people reporting to them, you remember the one level we talked about in the other class? Basically, they've got to be involved, and if they have people, they're called a Facilitator Manager. Team leaders, our first choice is by volunteer. Most of the time we don't get a volunteer. We usually try to go out and select that person, ask that frontline person that they're reporting to, and you usually know the people that will help out. And you want to go ask them that they've been selected, because they have been selected, and we'd like for them to participate as a leader in the program. And so as this goes on, is that because again we try to get volunteers, and because of the 4 barriers, people aren't going to volunteer. This goes back to what we were talking about, is that that's why it has to come from leadership. Leadership has to support it. If they don't support it, it ain't going to happen. Team members, and then everybody that's left out of that haven't been selected in the training leadership are team members, and everybody in the organization participates. So even if I'm on the steering committee, I'm also participating in training. Let's look at page number 5. Page number 5 here is the roles and responsibilities. If you look at that, this kind of further goes in depth of what we're talking about, the duties and the responsibilities or the roles of each of these things we just described. So if you want to take this back, you can look at that. Our team members, it gives you some guidelines of code of conduct. Our team leaders, it talks about what they've got to do in order to help the team to be a success. And our coordinator basically serves as the administrator for the program, and they're basically collecting the data. And also too, if the team leaders are having any problems, the coordinator is there to help. And facilitator managers. Now, the other reason we do the management that have people reporting to them, down the road we start getting into what we call base work center task teams, and that's when we start working and coming to an agreement on those base work centers that we're learning the skills. So what we're saying, that's where we were talking about, all managers are facilitator managers. So the one level thing that we did a while back, basically we will have that one level reporting that will come back, and that will be a facilitator manager. So if I have 3 base work centers reporting to me, I will be a facilitator manager for potential 3 base work center task teams. Let's look at a facilitator. The facilitator is responsible for providing management with support. What we're looking at there is that the management is not only getting the support from the facilitators, but the facilitators are supporting the team. And that is that sometimes up front, we almost have to kind of referee these teams, because when you start getting the team members in there, they're so frustrated and have so much pent-up frustration, they're just attacking everything under the world. And so what we're talking about here is that the facilitator there is nothing else to kind of help calm them down, and also make sure that the agendas and the stuff are being done, and also fill in for the team leader. Resource people. A resource person is basically somebody that the team invites to the team meetings in order to get their area of expertise and control. They might not be a part of the team, but we invite them in because we need them for that particular issue. The steering committee, again, is the recommending body that establishes and monitors the overall problem-solving process and the Base Work Systems 2000. So if you're looking at, these are the folks now that are running the organization, that are now running the training program. And they're given that direction and the support. What we've said is that it's so important to get the support of the upper management, because when there's fear, remember, we're all scared to death of, if we jump on, is it going to aggravate our boss or not? So if you look at it, that's where we're talking about having to participate. If you now will turn to page 6, page 6 is the final team members form. Okay, as we start defining the organizational team structure, let's look at that form. Up top, every time we complete a form, we want to put the date the form was started. So on that, we want to just put, because this final team members form is to help us organize those reporting base work centers and put them in the teams. Remember that stuff we did before in defining the organizational structure? You can go back to that information, and it's going to help lay this thing out. So if you look at this, we need to put whoever the leader of the team is, and then as we go down through the program, the team then selects a team name, and then we also assign a facilitator. You remember we talked about the facilitator. And then we also have, as we're collecting this data, we'll put in there, when do we need this information turned back into us? And then on the team members, we're really asking you to kind of put their first name, then their last name, and print it. My goodness, you wouldn't believe some of the writing out there. They try to write it and we can't even read it when it comes in. So we're asking you to print it. Not only that, but we're asking you to put the base work center, your job, or your title. Now, we even get some confusion on what all that stuff is. Then if nothing else, we say just put what you think it is. It doesn't matter at this time. We'll figure all that out down the road. If you want to look at the base work center number, and what we do is that we assign numbers, usually working off of the accounting list, because the accounting usually has assigned numbers to departments for accounting purposes, and then we add in some numbers on the end to give us a what we call a base work center number, and that will help us track the procedures as we develop them. If you look kind of down at the bottom of this thing, it says the meeting date. So what is happening as a leader in the organization, as a manager? Remember that stuff we did reporting one level. I'm going over that. I'm passing out this form. If I have people reporting to me, I am going in to the people that are reporting to me and start organizing the teams. And in that, we're going to say, give me a recommendation. Is it first week, second, or third, or fourth week? Circle 2, and what we're saying, what's the best time that you feel that we have? Is it AM or PM, and what day of the week? One of the interesting things here, we have to get the employees involved, especially in here, because if we set the meetings and the times for them, they're going to tell us every reason in the world why they can't do it. So what we've got to do is say, you take this back, you figure out what is the best time to do the training. There's other things that maybe we're going to give recommendations of, either like Tuesdays or Thursdays or Fridays or first week or whatever. Steering committee will have to make that decision. So what you're looking at here, and we even have people starting out that start getting fearful for they're going, hey, they're going to schedule it at the end of the day, then they're all going to get an hour overtime, and all. Your people are going to do fine. Don't worry about that. So in that, we get this form filled out the best that we can. We put some proposed dates on there. We turn that thing back into our facilitator manager, or who I'm reporting to. And then what happens? Then we make a decision, and then we plan and schedule our team meetings a year in advance, which kind of brings us to page number 7, which is the team meeting 12-month schedule. Okay, now look at what we've done. Over these last few classes here, we've defined the organizational structure that kind of really started setting up some interesting things in regards to our systems and in regards to our team and our team structure. So, but that was the reason of having to start developing our organizational structure. It started setting up not only the base work centers, but started setting up our team structure. So now what we need to do is that after we get an agreement on who's on what team, when are they going to meet, we need to now post it. Example, if you look here, if you look up top, it says team number, you just put their team number there, and then it's 1 through 12, and what you would do is put, and we're saying two hours of training a month, and we try to space them out every other week. Don't try to do them 2 hours at one time, because what you'll see, there will be a certain few that'll just rush through it and not even get it done, and they're done in 20 minutes. Remember, a lot of the reason for this 12-month in advance plus scheduling an hour every other week is a part of the discipline. This in itself starts setting discipline internally within the organization, because we have to start planning now. And remember, this now starts and becomes one of the first tangible issues or deal points that we can work with, mainly to hold the 1% accountable. Because your 1% that affects 5% with the same negative characteristics that affect 20%, they're not going to come to this stuff. And they're going to tell you every reason in the world why they're not going to attend. So this we'll start removing the personalities from this thing, and this will be one of the starts of collecting the data. That's why we have to manage this stuff. So the 1% that affect 5% that affect 20%, this is where it will first start showing up, who's participating or not. Now, we can't look at it and say, are they listening, are they paying attention? As we're developing the base work centers, that'll take care of itself. They will either get in and get involved, or the heck, the team's going to do it and the organization's going to do it. It doesn't matter. They're not going to derail us. So here, by having the schedule in advance, we're going to see that the 1% will not attend the training. They're going to make every reason in the world not to do it. Then in turn, that will move from that person hearsay, because you remember we said they're very good at covering their tracks. This will be a clear-cut data that we can deal with to hold that 1% accountable. Okay, so that's our team meeting. So after we collect our final team member forms, then we bring them in, we agree on the schedule, and then we put them into our team meeting 12-month schedule. And then we turn that thing in, and then we want to post all that. So if you look at it, that's kind of what we've done now, is that we've set up the teams and we set up the team schedule. Remember, that's why we have to set it a year in advance, because that starts setting some discipline. And they're going, well, I'm not sure where the company's going to be in 12 months. I don't care. Put it down, and then we'll adjust it when we have to. But what you'll see, that'll become the excuse for everything internally within the organization, and already probably is, for not only this, but every other thing. And what you'll see as we start formalizing this program, you will see that all of a sudden the misery in everybody's life now will be the training program. But it's interesting. We're saying, we talked before in the change about the change agent. If you take this program out, or these base skills out, or this applied business science out, it'll be replaced by another tragedy. Right now, the 1% will use this and every reason to derail what's happening internally within the organization. And remember, those folks don't even have a problem, just a bald-faced lie. So what's going to happen is that they're going to do everything in the world to try to derail what we're doing or what the organization is doing. And this is the thing that we're saying is that step back and look at this person that's doing all the sitting on the sideline, and the ones that are always happy and are unhappy and moving from one tragedy to the next. They're not doing anything to help the company, but they're telling everybody that the only reason I'm here is to help my company. That's a crock right there. Okay, personal seminars. This is an interesting story. As we developed the organization-based Work Systems 2000, we began to believe that there was a great need for personal skill training. And that's on page number 8. As a result, we developed what we call one-page, one-hour workshops. And that's what we're doing right now. Because as we got in there, we saw that our people had base skill training needs in regards to interpersonal skill, team, and problem solving and stuff. So we literally started writing these one-page, one-hour workshops that were short, concise, focused in on one thing. So if you look at the one-page, one-hour workshops, resulted out of a need like the entire program did in these organizations. The personal seminars. These were developed as we experienced the need for teaching employees basic skills regarding communication, planning, scheduling, problem solving, task team, and teamwork. So again, as we got through this, I'd like to kind of read the life lesson. It says, interpersonal skill awareness brings new life to an organization and the community. Now, what are we saying here? Is that we realized not only did they need the planning, schedule, managing, and monitoring, the process skills, the problem-solving skills, the task team skills, but they also needed some interpersonal skills. By getting into these teams and interacting with one another, talking on what they knew about, their jobs started opening up themselves and being able to communicate. Because remember, a lot of our workforce has not been in a structured meeting since high school. So if you look at that, to sit into a meeting is really a tough thing for a lot of folks. And not only that, but to speak up. So that's what we're talking about, the personal seminars. We really believe one day it'll even filter in to where we're now going to seminars with our families to learn and enhance our skills. Because really the only thing that separates us from a third world, not an organization, but a third world country, is education and awareness. Our people are just as good in anywhere. It's the education and awareness that prevents them from progressing. And so what we're doing is trying to give them the skills. Let's look at page number 9, and page number 9 is department walls. Department walls form within a company when departments are forced to compete with one another. Now, that's another interesting thing. We talk about departmental walls, and when we're talking about competing, a lot of times we start incentives or bonuses or whatever you want to call it in one department. And what happens is that when we start these incentives or bonuses, we start focusing internally in the organization and in those departments, not necessarily what's best for the organization, but what's best for my department. I got to hit the numbers. So if you look at when we internally, when we start competing against one department, the walls start going up because we're going to get my deal at the expense of the other, and so we start shutting down even further. So if you look at the departmental walls, this is one of the things that the fear and all the other barriers are looking at. There's departmental walls. So if we're starting to compete with one another, it's going to drive the organization apart, not together. As long as I met my numbers and quotas, that's all I cared about. It doesn't matter how the walls affected the overall operation. It does, however, affect the whole organization. This is what we just said, is that as long as I get my numbers, my quota, that's all I care about. I got to hit my numbers because that's how I'm being judged. But what happens is it might not show up in our department. Usually we're passing it to another department. So what happens, that department gets fed up. That's where the walls start coming up. And especially when you're an informal organization, man, it's just a hit and a miss. And so if you look at all these things that can go wrong internally, that what we're doing, pay by incentive. Man, what you're going to see, that stuff is out there surfacing again. It ain't even worked in business. Now we're passing it on to education and everything else. It ain't going to work. It's short-lived. We'll get some stuff out of it, but it'll start, folks internally will start manipulated. They'll get whatever ridiculous number that you want. They'll collect their bonus, and our product's going down, and our customer satisfaction's going down. Here's the life lesson. Departmental quotas and incentives usually build departmental walls which become barriers to quality. They do this by creating competition from one department to the other, resulting in one department winning, another one losing. The ultimate loser is going to be the customer as well as the company's long-term client base. Because again, is that it's interesting. I love these phone banks or these customer service. They're going, hey, you got to answer 20 calls an hour. And guess what happens? I answer 20 calls an hour, then all of a sudden I'm hanging up or transfer them. Then what you see, the majority of the calls, that were our call load doubles, and then all of a sudden what is happening? We're sitting here ditching our calls off, we're hitting our numbers and our quotas, but guess who it's aggravating? It's aggravating our customers. Our first question should be is, why in the world are we getting all these calls? Instead of what we do, hey, I tell you what, we'll give you $1 for every call you answer, but if every call you answer over the quota, which is 20. They've been passing that stuff around for all these years, and it still has not worked. I wish Dr. Deming was still around to kind of get him fired up on this, because they've got evidence of over the last 50 years of it not working. Remember, you don't need to put that incentive in your employees. You just have to give them the responsibility and the trust and treat them with respect, and they're going to do any and everything they can to help the organization. Again, that's a part of that line item management. Okay, and then let's look at now on page number 10. Okay, page number 10, now in effect, that is, how do the 4 barriers to quality affect team members? These are just some points that we really want to kind of go over and touch on lightly, but they're good bullet points as an example that you can take back and kind of look at, and y'all can fill in the blanks with this. And it says, we want to look at, up at the top, it says existing way of doing business. If you look at that, we talk about the existing way of doing business, and over on the right, we're talking about breaking through the 4 barriers to quality. Okay, the existing way of doing business is currently how we're doing it. On the right-hand side is breaking through the 4 barriers of quality. Okay, let's look at the first one there. It looks like fear of expression and our action. Okay, internally within that organization, we have fear of expression and or action. That's one of the 4 barriers. That's one we talked about earlier. When there's no fear in an organization, the organization becomes fearless, it is secure with themselves and one another, self-confident, and unconcerned about their action. And if the fear is down, then we're going to step up and make a decision off of what we think is right, not necessarily what I'm going to say or do to make sure you don't get mad at me. So if you look at breaking through the 4 barriers to quality in these team meetings, that's why and how we have effective team meetings. Let's look now at lack of communication, verbal and or written, and open communication. When there's lack of communication, especially when we just get started in here, you're withholding your thoughts. In that, mainly because of the fear, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what you're asking for. I'm only going to tell you what's safe. I'm only going to tell you something to make sure that I just don't get the tar whipped out of me. The next thing is open communication. So the lack of communication, when we're working on the barriers, it opens up, and we pretty soon have full disclosure. We're also putting all the cards on the table. Now what we're doing is we're responding to the team's needs, not necessarily mine or what I think that the organization wants, and it starts to have openness and free flow of information. Next is lack of written procedure, implied. How does this affect the team? The 4 barriers. Let's look at that. The written procedure. When you have lack of written procedure, which we're saying is implied, really what you have is confusion, disorder, hit and a miss, and redo of work and effort. So again, we're talking about when we're in an informal organization, existing, how we're doing business, these are the things that are making us work probably 40% inefficient. Written procedure. By writing the procedure, how does this help the team? We start clarifying our systems. And out of that, we're starting to organize our base work centers, our organization. And it has a directive of efforts, meaning that we're going in one direction. We all are understanding and gained the base skills, and then our processes are defined. And with it being defined, we know what we got to do. Because if you look at this, if we are defining those procedures, we're focusing on our base work centers, we know what we got to do. We got to define those base work centers. Remember, by focusing on these 4 barriers, by meeting and being in team meetings, remember the fear. Every time we see each other interact with my boss or other department without beating each other up, the fear goes down, the trust goes up, the communication goes up, and as we start writing procedure, then what happens is it's something of common that we can all relate to and talk to, and that's why it's important that the entire organization participate. Because again, if the entire organization isn't participating, it's going to short circuit what we're trying to do. The lack of training, the formal training. Okay, when you have lack of training, this is uninformed workers, unknowing, unreasoned, unattainable. We just can't get there. If we ain't got the training, we ain't going to get nowhere. And when we have a formal training, we're understanding how the 4 barriers affect ourselves and our organization. Also looking at how do the 4 barriers affect our families? How does the 4 barriers affect our personal relationship? In summary, the team should also be aware of the effects of the 4 barriers and the agreement or quality outcome have on each team member. So when we get into our teams, this is really a good thing, and this could really be a good meeting that you guys could have with one another, is get in there and let's talk about these. These are good bullet points. It'll stimulate conversation, and what it'll do is that we'll start getting the stuff out on the table. And if we're talking about this, we're not talking about each other. So in effect, it's kind of safe, but by putting these issues on the table, as an example, just having the awareness of how these 4 barriers are affecting the team, we're now stepping back and looking And we're now recognizing all these things that are short-circuiting the way the organization is wanting to go. So by this 4 barriers to quality awareness, and as the teams look at these things, then we start to understand what's happening to us. When we understand and have that awareness, now we can start to fix the things. That's the importance of understanding this. This is the importance of developing the team structure. Because in the organization, once we define the organizational structure, which kind of starts setting up for the team and the team structure, now we can get in and start defining those base work centers, and that's the stuff that we'll be getting into the other classes down the road. So again, we have to set up the organizational structure. Now we're having to set up the team structure. The reason we have to do that, we have to have a structured time and meeting place to define the organization. Because if we don't, it'll never happen. We'll continually go from one meeting to the next and not accomplish anything. All right, now if you'll look at page number 11, frequently asked questions and our thoughts. In this, it says, why schedule training a year in advance? If you look at why schedule the training a year in advance, because that helps set some simple scheduling and planning and managing and monitoring of what we're doing and some good habits internally. Yes, you're going to have everybody raising Cain about it and tell you every reason why we can't do it, but believe me, we've had just hardcore manufacturing companies that were spitting out widgets by the second that they were able to do it. But it takes work, and it takes everybody in the organization involved in it. So the reason we schedule training a year in advance, number one, the big thing is start setting up discipline. Because again, how many meetings have y'all had that the meetings were late, or we missed them, or we said we're going to reschedule them, and we never rescheduled the things? So what here is, it's starting to set that discipline. By setting that 1 hour, we now have to set time on each side of that personally to make sure that we get there. The other thing is, we can start collecting data, because remember, the 1 to 20% are going to abuse this. They're not going to participate. They're going to try every reason in the world why they're different, why they're exempt, why they don't have to do it. And I've been sitting around the locker room telling everybody how mean I was and how tough and how I wasn't going to buy off on this. So what you've got to do is that the organization and the leadership, because your team members will hold them accountable. And what you see is that we found statistically that in the 8th or 9th month, the employees come to us. We now have it in the program, written into the program, in about the 8th or 9th month saying, hey, that guy's missing training, why? I said, that's a good question, not supposed to. They write their first quality issue. Not only that, when we go back and look at, you don't have a good absenteeism or tardiness policy, or it doesn't exist, or it is not enforced, or I love the great one, at supervisor's discretion. What in the world do you think that says, and what is that setting tone for? That's setting tone for what we call in Alabama brother-in-law. Is that if you're my brother-in-law, I'll give you a special deal. So what happens is that starts setting double standards. That in turn starts setting hidden agendas, and the whole mess starts again. There goes your trust. So this is a good way. Let's look at number 2 there. We're talking about, what does LTD mean? We learn through doing. This is what we talk about. We can read over all this stuff until we get into the actual environment, get into the team meetings, and get started doing this, or the only way we're going to learn it. I guarantee you, you're going to have questions with everything. But until you get in there and start filling it out and start doing it, that's how you learn. And what you're going to see too, it's real interesting. We can have the same meeting agenda, and we had Mark Aiken, I think we had, good night, I think 70 teams or something. He went to all the meetings. He's going, it's interesting. We had like 70 different team meetings, and every one of them, even though we're covering the same information, they gave it a different twist. But by the structure of the program, we still came out with the same result, but they focused on a little different thing. The other interesting thing, we can teach the same thing in class, and we can have 5 people, and we recommend 4 to 7 per team meeting, is that all 3 or 4 or 7 will take different issues and learn it and understand it for whatever reason. And then when one doesn't understand what the other one knows, then they start helping one another. So it's really interesting how that starts, because most people want to help, most people want to be a part of. And then it says, why does all management have to be involved in training? Because again, the management is the leadership. There's absolutely no way possible in the organization for the training to succeed long term if management's not involved. Because here we go again, they're shoving it down our throats, and again, we're going to do it until it gets uncomfortable, then we're going to quit and we're going to run to something else. And that's why we only do 2-year training programs, and we're recommending to you only 2-year. Because when it starts getting bumpy, the first thing we want to do is bail out of it. We've been bailing out of too much. We've let that 1 to 5 to 20% manipulate us long enough. Let's get control of it. Focus in on your good people. What if somebody comes up and we miss our training date? Because of the information is generic, the applied business science, you're able to go to any of the meetings and make those up, but it's the team member's responsibility. We don't need to have a boss chasing somebody around making sure they're going to meetings, because I also hear that, hey, we're big people, we're not children. You don't have, believe me, we end up almost having to do some of that stuff. The next one is the organization won't follow through with the training commitment. That's one of the biggest things that we hear is that, oh, we tried this before, we got started with training, we got gung-ho about training, they won't follow through. This is why it's a minimum of a 2-year commitment for your organization, because again, it sets the tone for change, and if you don't hold it accountable, you will drop it and run. The first little hiccup in it, and we talked about the 1% are masters at that, you're going to drop it and run, and then what you'll see, each time you'll stop and start, and after 5 or 10 years, you won't have got anything that you were talking about you needed to do accomplished. So we have to follow through. You've got to develop the trust. Remember, that's a trust issue right there. Not necessarily from your organization, other company, the environment, past, home life, or whatever. How do you select the teams? The best way to do is select the teams by internal customer and suppliers, trying to work into a department and trying to get everybody and let those people decide their best times to meet. What are we going to train on? We're going to train on base skills to define our base work centers. Literally, that's what we're going to do. We're going to focus in on our job, because what are we all trying to do? We're trying to do and get training to improve the way we're doing our job. Training is an expense, and/or we can't afford to train. How can you afford not to train? And I hate that. That's what they always used to throw, how can you afford not to train? We're saying just get started, and we have to change the mentality, and look at most of the successful companies out there have good training programs in place. How long should we train? Hey, Bruce, after the 2 years, are we out of this? Are we done? What all of the organizations have seen, by going through a minimum 2 years, we have pushed so much up into the organization, it's just a starting point. Training needs to be continuous and from here on out. How do the 4 barriers to quality affect team and team members? That's what we talked about a minute ago, is that when the 4 barriers are there, we're going to have the teams that are going to be very reactive to whatever is said. They might not read, they might not participate. So we have to be conscious of those 4 barriers in this team environment and not take it personal. So what we've done today is talk about developing our team structure. So we want you to step back and look at how we go in this and take and define the team structure. Thank you, and I want you to think about the 4 barriers again.